You know, a good reminder from Genesis chapter 1, verse 3 is God always pierces the darkness, always. And the darkness doesn't last.
And the high priest, the great high priest who is Jesus Christ, he puts his hands on your life and you take your hands off and you say, my life is surrendered for your purposes.
Welcome everybody back to the Downline podcast with my buddy Jason Cook, who's coming on again. Jason, so good to see you. At Downline, we want to see biblical disciple making catalyze and thrive in and through the local church. And this podcast is meant for Christ followers who want to walk faithfully with Jesus while pouring their lives into others. Jason, welcome back.
Man, it's always a joy to be with you, sir.
We talked for like an hour before we started recording, so now I feel like I don't have anything else to say to you.
Well, that's what good friends do. I figure we got a few things we could talk about today.
Well, first of all, for those that maybe haven't listened in the past, Jason, longtime pastor in Memphis, now pastor in Fellowship Roswell in the greater Atlanta area, former Ole Miss legend, which we don't hold against him, but a really good friend, been on the Downline board, teaches for us in the Institute every year. So thanks again for your investment in Downline.
Well, I say this every time I get on here, but Downline has directly been a blessing to my own family. My wife is a Downline graduate. I've been so blessed by Soup and others, I love Downline, bro. So whatever I can do to help serve the mission that God has called y'all to, man, it's a joy for me.
All right. Well, the podcast is away. And I noticed, I talked to you a few days ago, that you or your church at least preached through James, or has been, or maybe it's finished now for the summer. And I was already planning on preaching through it out here at Redeemer in Dripping Springs in the fall. So the good news for me is, like every pastor, I'm just going to steal your stuff and use it as my own.
Well, I told you this too. I mean, unfortunately for you, I only preached 3 sermons of this entire summer series, but it has been a really solid series for us. Our folks love the Bible, but they've really enjoyed the book of James, and the other guys preaching it have done a really good job.
Well, the thing that I think, especially for, Downline and those engaged in discipleship and disciple making, tell me about your tagline on that series, Grit meets Grace, or Grace meets Grit. I can't remember which one came first, but how do you see that capturing the book of James?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I think one, the title comes out of both the content in James, but also it's forcing me to play with my left hand, if you will, because I am always going to err on the side of grace. God is gracious and kind, merciful, abounding in steadfast love, slow to anger. That's who he is. God's grace, God's kindness leads us to repentance. It is grace that has saved us, not of our work, right? So I personally, in my preaching, am going to lean heavy into grace. And if I had a weakness in my preaching, it is failing to consistently show how grace intersects with just good, obedient, hard work in the Christian. So enter James. You got James, which has an entire book, is a very pragmatic book. It reads like wisdom literature, and it's very directive. James, who's a leader in the Jerusalem church, it's very directive, very concrete. Do this, do that. And so, but at the same time, there are these elements of grace. And so when you think about really what James's unique contribution to the canon is, it is the intersection, I think, of where the grace of God and God's empowering presence meets our own obedience that leads, I think, to spiritual flourishing.
And I was listening to one of your messages. I do think you're the only person I've heard reference Milli Vanilli in the last 30 years.
Well, bro, I got multiple cultures in my church, man. So I'm just trying to find a way to bring us all together, homie.
Milli Vanilli hits exactly 0 cultures.
Milli Vanilli. If you're a Gen Xer, and you grew up in the 70s and 80s and you kind of peaked in your 80s, you know who Milli Vanilli is.
Man, blame it on the rain, baby.
You already know.
But that was kind of centered around this idea of one-hit wonders, which wasn't even his hit. But James, you kind of make the point, which I think is a good point. It's got several of those little punchers, right? if I'm just thinking out loud, don't just be hearers, be doers.
Hmm.
Who looks at a mirror and walks away and forgets his own reflection? And then obviously, faith without works is dead, which is probably the one that most people uh, zeroing in on that one, because Luther had a problem with James. I mean,
Yes, he
pretty
did.
public, outspoken problem with James. Uh, how would you explain to someone they're reading James, they're reading Paul,
Hmm.
and they're going, boy, this guy makes me feel like I'm not justified unless I work myself to death. This guy says it's all by grace. There's clearly a contradiction.
Right, right. And I would say the on the surface, it would appear that there would be,
Mm-hmm.
except when you realize that they're coming at the same issue from two different angles.
Mm-hmm.
So Paul is coming at the issue where he's talking about salvation. So someone who's not a Christian is coming into salvation. Salvation itself, our justification, is a act and a work of God's grace,
Yep.
right? So it is by grace we have been saved. Well, now James comes in and James is picking up the baton and he's talking about post conversion. He's talking about your post conversion life and how that reveals the genuineness of your conversion. So he's going to say faith without works is dead. So a saving faith is a working faith. It's going to
Mm.
reveal itself in good works. Now, interestingly, where Paul and James get on the same page is in Ephesians 2:10,
Mm-hmm.
where uh, you know Paul writes that God has set out, we are the masterpiece of God, who God has ordained for us good works beforehand. So
Yep.
if Paul is saying you need grace to be saved, and it's not your own effort. Another way to say that is R.C. Sproul has famously said, "We are saved by good works, just not yours."
Mm.
Um, and James is coming at it post our salvation and saying that the genuineness or the testing of the validity of your faith is found in how you live that faith out. Now you realize they're talking about essentially the Christian life from two different vantage points, using the same language but deploying it in a different way.
And that's really well said. And even I think a lot of people get confused too, because James uses that idea of justified, right? Which is a massive, massive theological term Paul uses extensively, especially Romans chapter 3. I think we make the error exegetically when we don't stop and say, well, justified in what sense? Like if justification is in a way vindication, right? Jesus justifies, you are vindicated as righteous because of Jesus. James is saying good works justify that you've been justified, if that
That's
makes
right.
sense.
That's right. Well said. Yep.
Uh, and and by the way, I think he's right,
He is.
because there you go 30 years as a professing Christian with zero transformation. Paul and James would both say we need to ask some questions about that.
Hmm.
Right? And that's where you that kind of grace meets grit. It's the say it's what Paul writes at Titus. I love this idea in Titus because, and I want your thoughts on this. I think we've narrowed the biblical idea of grace to one singular thing.
Hmm. Hmm.
And Paul tells Titus, grace trains you for righteousness, which intersects with an idea I think that James is getting at in his letter.
Hmm.
Uh, but what are your thoughts on that? Is just in the way that we capture grace, I think is far too narrow in the sense of how it operates.
Correct. Well, I think good readers of scripture will read a word like grace in Paul and directly associate it with salvation. And the correlation between the two are undoubtedly essential to the Christian faith. However, grace is so much bigger. So
Mm,
when you think about what grace is generally, grace generally is, yes, it's the kindness of God, but it's the empowering presence of God.
hmm
So when you think about grace, grace isn't only the power of God that allows us to call upon the name of Christ to be saved. It is the power of God that empowers life, period.
mm,
So grace itself, when you are conscious and aware that you are, the Christian is at this very moment, um, empowered by the very grace of God, then that Christian will over time begin to wake up to the reality that it's that power that's been training us for righteousness, because it's that power, it's the Spirit that continues to point our attention to Jesus, convict us of our sin, encourage us when we're down, bring supernatural joy to our hearts. And over time, the grace of God that's empowering us for the Christian life is training us in righteousness, because that grace is pushing us toward righteousness.
Okay, hold on. I'm going to interrupt you because, and we hadn't even talked about this, but why is it then, you mentioned power and presence, which certainly go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm.
Your just knee-jerk response to why then does it feel like, at least, we lack so much power in the Christian life, both individually and in the church? Because if I'm saved by grace, God indwells me via his Holy Spirit. Paul says in Romans, one of his big arguments is you can actually say no to sin because the resurrected power of Christ, the same power of the resurrection, lives in you constantly on an ongoing basis. But why don't we live in more freedom? Why don't we see more great acts of God in our own lives? Why aren't we tasting more transformation? We talk about power theologically, but where is it experientially?
So I don't want to speak on behalf of every church and every pastor, because I that would be impossible for me to. So I can only speak out of my own experience and where I'm currently located. I would say the reason that we don't see more power in the Christian life is because far few people are actually real Christians, and far more people like adding Jesus to their life or adding Christianity to their life. They like the social clout and value that comes, and there's very real social capital with associating yourself with the church. I would say the people who that's the first thing, and then the second thing is I think we live in a world where we don't have to depend on God in the same way that those in the ancient Near East did. We've got healthcare, we've got technology, we've got science, we've got money. And if we have a problem, our first knee jerk reaction often isn't, Lord, what do I do? It's, how much is that going to cost? Or what does WebMD say? Or let me call my doctor, or, insert whatever solution that we have.
Right.
So I think we're less aware of what's in us. But I think the third thing, man, if I'm honest, is cynicism. I don't think many Christians actually believe that God's power is in us and is able to do in us, because we've had experiences that may not have lent itself to that type of transformation. So I think those are just three small reasons, but I think the availability of the grace and the power and the presence of God is no less true, no less powerful, if we are willing to depend on the Lord, walk with him, and see that transformation in our own life. I know I've seen it in my own life, and I can only look back and say, had it not been for the power of God, that would still be a stronghold in my life.
Do you think that, and genuine question, I haven't spent a lot of time thinking on this, that in the same way that maybe grace has been more narrowly captured, that God's operating power has been more narrowly captured, in this sense that if I don't see a cancer diagnosis disappear, if I don't see something manifested with, my buddy Sam Sorens wouldn't even call it a sign gift, but a sign gift for our just conversation. If there aren't these just mind-blowing, out of ordinary experiential things, actually the power of God's not put in any other category, just those. Do you think there's a chance that we're actually experiencing it and missing it because we don't know what to call it?
Yeah, I think for some people, yeah. I mean, it reminds me of Elijah and the prophets of Baal. And shortly after that, God is passing by, and there's all these grand, epiphanies of God, earthquake, fire, lightning, but then there's the whisper of God. So I think the way I would answer your question is, in a real sense, each of us wants God to show up how we want him to show up, which means I think that we are precluded to look for God in particular ways and patterns. So when God doesn't show up in those particular ways or patterns, if we're careful, without discernment, we will say that's not God when actually it is. And it might be. So a cancer diagnosis, the perfect example, I'll give you two examples. A buddy of mine, he and his wife were going through a renovation. And when they got into this renovation, they found out they had termite damage that was pretty extensive. Now, had they not done the renovation, there would be no termite damage, right?
Sure.
Another buddy of mine goes in for a routine screening, the doctors end up finding cancer in a way that they had not found it before. Now they find it, and this brother is going to, live and live for a long life.
Hmm.
I think what we can see is trivial and menial and small. God can always blow that thing out and use it in his own glory. So I think the training in righteousness, if I can go back to the language in Titus,
Yep.
is to not have a fixed mind when it comes to God
Hmm.
and how God moves and how God looks, because God will often use um, the random stranger. He will use the supernatural angel. He'll use the text message. He'll use that
Yep.
email. He'll use the monetary gift. He'll use the words of a 3-year-old to absolutely wreck your
Hmm.
life. And
Hmm.
it's not exactly how you thought he would show up. Does that answer your question at all?
Yeah. But I don't think people would put that into the category of power a lot of times. That's where I
Oh
think
man,
we
it
need
totally
to
is.
attach it. But so to your point, and just to add one word of clarity to what Jason's saying is he's not saying an open mind in the sense of who God is. His nature and attributes are fixed. We're talking about how God shows up in powerful ways in our lives. That man, that's extensive, but again, I think it's been narrowly categorized. Speaking from experience,
Right. Right.
narrowly categorized. But how much more intimacy do you start finding in your walk with Jesus when you start going, well, that was God, and that was God, and that was God, and that like he has a genuine, all-encompassing interest in your life to the point that he will show up in ways that are unanticipated because dang it, that's kind of the only way he gets our attention sometimes.
That's right. That's right. Bro, like perfect example. Like could you take you and I, we're both from Alabama, tornadoes are a common thing where we're from. Could you harness the power of a tornado and put it in a wine bottle?
Mm,
Right? Could you take the depths and the power and the vastness of the ocean and put it inside of a coffee mug?
mm,
Like you can't.
right.
And so for us to begin to think that we are experts in how God moves and how God operates would be one of the most silly and foolish things in the world. But this is why I think the person and work of Christ is so dope, is because somehow God found a way to harness
Mm,
all of his power without sacrificing any and putting it inside of a human. Yeah, so the person and work of Christ is the power of God and the person of Christ together in a way that defies logic. And quite honestly, if we can't as believers accept the fact that God shows up and does things and is currently doing things,
doing
trillions of
things. Yeah.
things that we can't see in ways that we may or may not agree with in our own social location, then I think we've made God into our own image and we have too small a view of him. Now, to your point, God's attributes are immutable. They are unchanging. God is who he is. But the way that God moves, the entire, Eugene Peterson has this book called Christ Plays in 10,000 Places.
Okay. I haven't
Part of
read that
his,
one.
yeah, part of his point is that if you've got 10,000 things in the world, God is in all of them and using all of them. So the canvas of God's power in your life in the world is quite literally limitless. And I
Mm,
think in that same way, we should probably open ourselves up to be awed and inspired and in wonder and anticipating the
mm.
ways that God is going to show up in ways that we don't expect.
Well, and what an important thing to do just in a discipleship relationship is to try to recognize in your own life so you can testify to it, but also help other believers step back and just do a survey of how is God moving? How is he working? Right? What gifts has he given you? Right? Like all of these things, because I love what the late Tim Keller would always say. And I was always struck by this because I think Tim Keller, I never got the chance to meet him, like brainy, brilliant. And if you listen to his preaching the last, say, 10 years of his life, he was talking about this craving to experience his theology. And so I think that there is something in that in our own discipleship and training. I think we're scared of it because it feels subjective, right? But it seems biblically more accurate and dynamic that what we believe to be true about God is actually we taste it and feel it and experience it daily.
That's right. That's right.
Uh, so let me ask you this, because I only got you a few more minutes. One of your sermons, you talked about uh, godliness versus worldliness as unpacked in the book of James.
Mhm.
And well, you talk about a discipleship point with believers is, and I even find in my own heart, subconsciously, unintentionally, so much of the world dynamics and understanding, it just creeps in. And you start realizing I'm processing decisions or parenting, or like I'm processing things by worldly data points. They don't seem dangerous. They don't seem evil. But how did you approach that from James? And what were some of your big takeaways that you're going, man, if you're discipling somebody, don't miss these things.
Yeah. So in James 4, James, this is another one of those one hit wonders. He says, "Do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God?"
Hmm.
And he goes on to say that if we want to be friends of God, that we should draw near to God, because when we draw near to God, he will draw near to us. And then another one, resist the evil one and he will flee. Yeah, so it's this really beautiful passage in James 4, but I was really struck with, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Now, if you go back to James chapter 1, he's already talked about the double minded man
Yep.
who is tossed to and fro, right? And the
Yep.
double minded man in the ancient Near East, when James wrote this, would have been the person who professed to follow Jesus and love Yahweh, but lived a life that was separate from that confession. I think when you fast forward that to today, there are a lot of people who profess Jesus, but when you look at the fruit and the good works of their life, they don't tell the same story. So let me give you an example. When I was in college, the guy who discipled me caught me in egregious sin. This is actually post college. Caught me in egregious sin, and he showed me so much grace and kindness in that moment that it transformed my life.
Hmm.
A year later, I broke up with a girlfriend, and I was really upset and distraught about it. And he challenged me and he said, the way you've been going about your life, is the way that you're going about your life one in which you can honestly say that every decision you've made has considered God or has centered God in its center? And I was like, yeah, no, I haven't.
Hmm.
And he brought me to James 4, and he said, "Do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God?" And I think what he was saying is essentially this: we can't have a foot in the kingdom of God and a foot in the world from the standpoint of we are not, we don't have an allegiance wholly to God.
Yep.
And that's really what friendship with God is, an allegiance to God. So
Hmm.
Abraham is called a friend of God,
Friend of
allegiance to
God, right?
Moses is called a friend of God, allegiance to God. Both those dudes were sinful. Both those
Yeah.
dudes got it wrong a lot.
And Jesus tells the disciples, hey, now I call you my friends.
Call you my friends, and all them dudes left them. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not about being perfect, but I do think it is about having allegiance to God first and foremost. And then James follows that up and shows you how to do that. Draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Resist the
Resist.
evil one and
Yep.
he will resist you. So how do we become friends of God? We draw near to God. And it's the promise that God reflexively will come close to us as well. I think for anybody who's out there, it's like, oh, am I a friend of the world? And am I a friend of God? The real question is, have you earnestly and diligently sought God's face,
Mm.
the power of God's presence, intimacy with him? Like if I'm discipling someone, I'm always going to be pushing them, not just the head knowledge, but the experiential knowledge of, did God meet you today when you drew near to him? And I
Yes.
very rarely hear people say no. So
Mm.
I think that's kind of what James is
No,
getting
that's good. That's helpful. One of the things curious your perspective, that excited me about preaching through James this fall is in our cultural moment, there are few books, especially New Testament considered, that I think are more countercultural than James, because we now exist in we shouldn't tell people what to do. Primary concern should be what I say and how it makes you feel. Because we just did the Sermon on the Mount this summer, and we've jacked up that judgment passage so badly. Like, don't judge, but it's like, anyways, another podcast for another day. But James does not preach in 2025 to a cultural moment that doesn't want to be told they're wrong, doesn't want to be forced to make decisions, and doesn't want to have to be pegged down in any sense of black and white, right and wrong, righteous, unrighteous. But James just gets to the point. He says, no, there is this way or there is this way. And all the squishiness in between is compromise and unfaithfulness.
Yeah. Yeah. We live in an age of moral relativism, and where morality, even amongst professing Christians, is not a standard as much as it is relative to
A
my in
suggestion.
group
Yeah.
or my that's exactly right. So, but James, who you're talking about the guy who didn't believe his brother was the Messiah, who grew up with Jesus,
who in John 7 or 6, I have to look up, I think John 7, is mocking Jesus.
correct? That guy,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
obstinate brother. But what you see is when God changes him, now he becomes the leader. He's the one who extends the right hand of fellowship to Paul. He's the one who becomes, for these Christians in James that he's writing to, like, this is not a guy who's going to mince words. James is a general. James is a leader. James is coming. He's throwing fastballs right down the plate.
Yep.
And I think in a moral relativistic world, James helps us understand the standard of righteousness that God has. He helps us understand how we always fail to meet it, and yet how Jesus meets it, credits that to us. And then it's the call for us to not just intellectually believe that. Jamie,
right.
here's the challenge for the church in America is we give intellectual assent to a lot of things. And for us as Christians in the West, we like Jesus as memory. We don't like Jesus in praxis. When James is talking about the widow and the orphan and the immigrant, and he's talking about the poor, like, and what that looks like in terms of our own Christian life. So yeah, man, James is a tour de force against moral relativism, and he's a great asset for the church today, because everyone, if you're not uncomfortable reading or listening to James preach, you may not be a legitimate Christian.
Woo. Well, the other thing too is, you mentioned it. Like, I love that James holds out standards and promises.
Yeah.
And how those actually always go hand in hand. Like, we get some promises based simply off Christ and his righteousness being found in him. There are other promises, and I really believe this, there are other promises that God makes to us, but they don't come to us unless we're engaged. So, for example, draw near to him, he'll draw near to you. That is a promise. It doesn't say run from him and you'll have intimacy with him. It says draw near. It doesn't say play around with the devil's schemes and he'll flee. It says resist and he'll flee. These are promises, but they're promises with action points attached to them. Some promises are positional. Some promises are practical. And James is going, man, I want you to wake up in the morning and I want to show you how to live so that all of the promises, positional and practical, come home to you.
Yes. There are some promises we receive. There are other promises that find us. I don't know if you ever played hide and seek with your kids. You ever play hide and seek with your kids?
Yeah, they're all cheaters. Every single one of them.
They're all cheaters. But my kids, they love playing hide and seek, and they like being chased. Right.
And sometimes I tell them, y'all go hide. I'm gonna count to 300,000. They'll come find you in about 30 minutes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But one of my youngest, he loves to be the count. He wants to be the counter. He wants to be the one who's counting so he can go and find everybody else. And there will be times when we're playing hide and seek where I will hide so thoroughly. And the beginning of the search is really fun and it's exciting. And he's like, "Are you here? Are you here?" But after a while, you can see his face begin to fall. He starts to get frustrated. Then he starts to get angry. Then he starts to get sad. Like, "Dad, where in the world are you?" And then I pop out and I'm like, here I am. And then it's like tears go to joy. And it's like, wow, there you are. And I think the Christian life, following Jesus, is so similar in that we can so easily feel like we're in a cosmic divine game of hide and seek. God, where are you? Where are you? Where are you? But I think the promise that you mentioned, the promise that James gives, is that if you earnestly seek him, he will reach out and find you, and you will be surprised at the joy that you'll have when he pops up and when he shows his face and reveals himself to be who he is. That's one of the promises that gets sprung up on us. And it's one of the promises that God gives to us, but it comes not because we're running away from him. It comes because we're seeking him and we're trying to find him and we're drawing near to him.
And that whole idea of intimacy, I think power and intimacy are intrinsically connected, right? In John 14:21, he who loves me will obey me, and I will love him and manifest myself to him.
Yes.
I will give more and more. It's hard because positionally, God loves us right now more than he ever can or will. He doesn't love some future version of ourselves more. That's true, positionally. Yes. But in the daily dynamics of intimacy and power, you actually can have more or less of that depending on, am I grieving the Spirit? Am I quenching the Spirit? Am I obeying? Am I disobeying? It doesn't change your position. But I start to learn, do I really treasure God himself or God for his stuff when I go, I want intimacy over everything?
Yeah. Yeah. It doesn't change your position, but it doesn't change your position with God. It does change your experience of him.
100%. And James, pastorally, I think wants every Christ follower to taste that experience, but he knows here's what's going to jack it up. The way you talk is going to jack it up. The way you read the Bible and don't obey it's going to jack it up. Like all of these things are intimacy disruptors. And then it goes down the list. He said, I'm going to hit you here and I'm going to hit you here and I'm going to hit you here.
Yes. And all of those, I think, are, if I'm a disciple maker, and let's say I'm at a point in my time with my disciple where maybe we've gone through the book of John or we've gone through the book of Matthew, or I'm looking for something else. Like I would really, really, really want to dig in, especially for maybe not a brand new believer, but somebody who's been walking with Jesus for a year, a couple years, and they're progressing in their faith. I want to take them to the book of James because I think the book of James is a real challenge to check our motivation. Jesus tells us that out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Yep. James is telling us that what we say and what comes out of our tongue reveals what's inside of us. So I really want that disciple to have their own faith tested, have their own motivations tested for why they want to walk with Jesus.
That's right.
And there's just really no way that you can go through the book of James and not have that. I think it would be a wonderful resource for anyone who's walking with and making a disciple in the season.
Well, we'll tie a bow on it there, my good friend. Always good to see you.
Yeah, man, you too.
Lord willing, we can do ministry together one day. That's the bucket list.
One day. Lord help it, make it happen.
Okay. But I want to be assistant to the regional pastor. I want to be the main guy. I want to do that.
Well, I do need a teaching pastor, man. So we might have to have a conversation here in a couple of years for real.
All right.
If you ever leave Dripping Springs, man.
Hey, this is a little slice of heaven.
Man.
I take payment in Bitcoin only. That's my new.
Must be nice, bro.
Hey, love you. Talk soon.
Love you too, man. See you.